Sunday evening, May 16, 2004. Suburban Melbourne. Time for family roasts and early bedtimes. Instead, there were strobing blue and red lights, forensic officers in white smocks, and, moving among them, dark-suited detectives. Seasoned criminal turned police informant Terence Hodson and his wife Christine were found brutally executed in the lounge room of their Kew East home, each shot in the back of the head, their hands bound. The methodical nature of the killings bore all the hallmarks of a professional hit. Christine, an innocent bystander to her husband's dangerous world, became collateral damage, a chilling violation of the underworld's unspoken code against targeting family members. The murders came just months before Hodson was set to testify in a high-profile corruption trial against a powerful former Victorian drug squad detective. Hodson's path to becoming an informant began with a botched burglary alongside Detective David Meikle, leading him to expose corruption within the force, most notably implicating Detective Paul Dale. Despite the grave risks, he refused witness protection, leaving him dangerously exposed. His fate was sealed when confidential police files identifying him as an informant were leaked. Information had quickly spread through the criminal underworld. 2 weeks later, he and Christine were dead. The sheer brutality of their executions, described in reports as execution style, sent shockwaves through the state, forcing the Victorian government to establish the Office of Police Integrity. Its mission, to investigate the devastating breach that had turned a police informant into a marked man. Before Carl Williams became the most infamous inmate in Barwon Prison, an Australian high-risk and maximum security facility, he ruled Melbourne's underworld with an iron grip, his empire built on violence, deception, and an insatiable thirst for power. Yet when he finally stood before the court, accused of orchestrating multiple murders, he hardly looked the part of a feared crime lord. With his round face, dishevelled hair, and boyish grin, he seemed more like an unassuming suburban dad than the mastermind of one of Australia's deadliest gangland wars. But behind that facade lurked a ruthless puppet master, pulling the strings in a bloody battle for control. Williams' early years were spent in Western Melbourne, running with friends and his brother Shane, who would later die of a heroin overdose in 1997. He married convicted drug trafficker Roberta Mercica, with whom he had a daughter. Before his rise to infamy, he bounced between labouring jobs and even tried his hand at running a children's clothing store with his wife, a venture that ultimately failed. His descent into the criminal underworld accelerated on November 25, 1999, when he, his father George, and an associate were arrested in a major drug bust. Police raided an illegal amphetamine lab hidden inside a unit on Fir Close, Broadmeadows, seizing over 25,000 tablets, an estimated $20 million Australian dollars worth of illicit drugs. It was the first major strike against Williams, but far from the last. A month earlier, on October 13, 1999, Carl Williams took a bullet to the stomach, fired by none other than Jason Moran, another notorious Melbourne criminal. The reason? An $80,000 debt to the Moran family. That single shot ignited one of the most violent underworld wars in Australian history, now known as the Melbourne Gangland killings. Between January 1998 and August 2010, Melbourne's underworld became a battleground, with 36 figures assassinated in a brutal cycle of revenge. The killings were ruthless, calculated, and driven by power struggles between rival factions. As bodies piled up, a power vacuum emerged, plunging the city's criminal landscape into chaos. While many of these murders remain unsolved, detectives from the Piranha Task Force believe Williams orchestrated at least 10 of them, cementing his place as the mastermind behind Melbourne's bloodiest underworld war. At the height of his reign, Williams wasn't just a crime boss, he was a media-savvy gangster who revelled in his infamy. His exploits inspired Underbelly, a hit television series that brought the Gangland war into Australian living rooms. Williams himself was a devoted viewer, but when he saw his on-screen portrayal, he was livid. Despite his public persona, paranoia ran deep. Williams never dined at the same restaurant twice, constantly fearing that the violence he had unleashed would one day come back for him. In 2007, Carl Williams stood before the court, expressionless as he received 3 life sentences with a non-parole period of 35 years. His crimes? Ordering the executions of crime patriarch Lewis Moran, his son Jason, and drug dealer Mark Mullier. The fate of Mullier was particularly gruesome. His burnt remains were discovered stuffed inside a wheelie bin, only found when firefighters responded to a blaze. Williams' ruthless ambition extended beyond those murders. He was also handed a 25-year sentence for conspiring to kill Gangland rival Mario Condello, a former lawyer turned criminal power broker. Condello, a key player in the Melbourne Gangland War, was believed to be a money launderer for the feared Calabrian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta. His murder plot only further cemented Williams' reputation as Melbourne's most dangerous crime lord. The judge didn't mince words. Williams was no fearless gangster. He was a coward who never pulled the trigger himself, instead paying others to do his killing. But even in a prison jumpsuit, Williams remained a larger-than-life figure. His ex-wife Roberta kept his name in the spotlight, gracing magazine covers in bikinis and cashing in on their infamy. Yet despite the bars surrounding him, Williams still believed he could outmaneuver his enemies. His most reckless move was yet to come, and it'd be his last. While locked away in Barwon Prison, Carl Williams made a fateful decision. He turned informant. In exchange for his cooperation, he provided damning evidence linking former detective Paul Dale to the brutal murders of police informant Terence Hodson and his wife. The deal came with perks, including financial assistance for his family. One revelation caused a media storm. Police had reportedly covered $8,000 in private school fees for Williams' daughter, a glaring sign of how valuable his cooperation had become. But inside Barwon, being a snitch was a death sentence. Matthew the General Johnson wasn't a kingpin or a crime lord, but within the prison system, his reputation was built on raw violence. A career criminal forged in decades behind bars, Johnson had one unshakable code: no tolerance for informants. Word spread fast in Barwon. Carl Williams was feeding intel to the cops. He'd accused Paul Dale of ordering the execution of Terence Hodson to silence him before he could testify. Williams thought his statements were confined to official records, but he underestimated Johnson. Evidence later revealed that Johnson had accessed Williams' computer, pulling up files that exposed his cooperation with authorities. The moment Johnson read those statements, his mind was made up. Carl Williams was a dead man walking. Carl Williams lounged in the secure unit of HM Prison Barwon, casually flipping through a newspaper, maybe scanning the crime section for his own name. After all, even in prison, he was still front-page news. He might have even felt a flicker of pride at the headlines detailing his past, his power, his influence. But Williams was about to make the biggest headline of his life. The only problem? He wouldn't live to read it. Matthew the General Johnson had once been friendly with Williams. In the cutthroat world of Barwon, alliances were built on convenience, and for a time, Williams and Johnson had shared laughs, meals, even a warped sense of camaraderie. But Johnson had his own code, one that left no room for informants. And when he discovered that Williams had been feeding information to police, that so-called friendship turned to seething contempt. Williams had no reason to be on high alert. He wasn't expecting an attack. After all, this was the high security unit, away from the general prison population. He was comfortable, relaxed, his head tilted slightly as he read, oblivious to the figure moving toward him. Johnson wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. In his hand, he gripped a crude but deadly weapon, an iron bar torn from the frame of an exercise bike in the unit, a brutal tool for a brutal job. He positioned himself directly behind Williams, towering over the seated crime boss. And then, without hesitation, he swung. The first blow landed with a sickening crack, the iron caving into Williams' skull. Blood sprayed across the table, staining the newspaper in his hands. His body jerked violently, but Johnson wasn't done. He swung again, and again. Each strike was delivered with methodical precision, crushing bone, snuffing out the life of a man who had once ruled Melbourne's underworld with an iron grip. By the time guards arrived, the attack was over. Williams lay slumped over the table, his once feared presence reduced to a lifeless, bloodied corpse. Johnson stood nearby, weapon in hand, utterly unfazed. He had done what he set out to do. Dealers might be powerful on the streets, but inside they would just prey for men like Johnson. When news broke that Carl Williams had been bludgeoned to death in his prison unit, the public demanded answers. Who was the man who had delivered the fatal blows, and why had he done it? The killer was Matthew the General Johnson, a career criminal and the self-proclaimed founder of a prison gang called Prisoners of War. But when it came time to face justice, Johnson denied that his motive was hatred for informants. Instead, he claimed Williams had lied to him, telling him that his cooperation with police was all a sham, a fabricated story designed to manipulate authorities. Williams had allegedly called the case against former detective Paul Dale a fugazi, a fake. When the trial began, Johnson spun his own fate. He insisted that he had acted in self-defense, that Williams had been plotting to kill him first. But the jury wasn't buying it. His attempt to rewrite the story of that brutal prison attack collapsed, and he was found guilty of murder. Meanwhile, the case against Paul Dale, the disgraced cop Carl Williams had been informing on, crumbled in Williams' absence. With the crime boss silenced forever, so too were the allegations that might have brought Dale down. In the end, Matthew Johnson had done more than kill Carl Williams. He had buried the truth along with him. Long before he made headlines for murdering Carl Williams, Johnson was a one-man crime wave. His rap sheet wasn't just lengthy, it was monstrous. A staggering 167 prior convictions spanning armed robbery, assault, illegal firearms possession, and burglary. Violence wasn't just part of his life, it was his life. One of the most chilling crime sprees happened 3 years before he killed Williams. Johnson and an accomplice went on a brutal rampage, choosing victims at random. Outside a McDonald's, they dragged the mother from her car at gunpoint, while Johnson's partner punched her teenage daughter in the face. Later that night, convinced they were targeting drug dealers, they stormed into a private home and held a couple at gunpoint, terrorizing them before making off with their valuables. When police finally caught up with Johnson, he was sitting in a stolen car at a railway station, as if scouting his next target. In court, Johnson was impossible to ignore. His imposing frame, shaved head, and ice-cold stare radiated pure menace. One journalist, watching him from just a few meters away, later admitted he had a terrifying thought. If Johnson suddenly lashed out, he could have taken down half the courtroom in seconds. He had the presence of a man who had lived in violence for so long that it had rewired his brain, leaving him in a permanent state of raw aggression. Prison was never a punishment for Johnson. It was home. By 21, he'd already done time in the notorious Pentridge prison, but incarceration didn't break him, it sharpened him. He didn't just survive the system, he mastered it, becoming more ruthless, more cunning, and more dangerous. Inside, he wasn't just another inmate, he was a force. The self-proclaimed general of prisoners of war, a prison gang built on old-school criminal codes of loyalty and extreme violence. In Johnson's world, informants weren't just enemies, they were vermin, and he had no intention of letting one live among him. Years before he bludgeoned Carl Williams to death, Matthew the General Johnson had already shown his willingness to kill behind bars. In a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come, he and several other inmates spent 45 minutes dismantling a security window, determined to reach a protected prisoner, a known informant. When they finally broke through, the assault was merciless. Just like with Williams, Johnson grabbed a piece of exercise equipment, a seat from a stationary bike, and used it as a weapon, smashing it into his victim with ruthless precision. This time, however, the man survived. The trial that followed was nothing short of chaos. Dubbed the trial from hell, Johnson and his co-accused turned the courtroom into a grotesque spectacle. One inmate smuggled in a bag of excrement and hurled it at the jury. Others pulled down their pants, flashing their backsides in defiance. Johnson, always one for theatrics, chose a more crude form of mockery, leaning into the courtroom microphone and farting, smirking as the judge looked on in disgust. These weren't men seeking redemption. They were predators who thrived on anarchy and violence. Carl Williams' death not only ended his bloody reign, but also shattered a high-profile case. Williams had told police that he had been paid $150,000 by disgraced cop Paul Dale to arrange the murder of Terence Hodson, a police informant. Prosecutors had hoped Williams would testify, but with his murder, the case collapsed. Suspected hitman Rodney Collins and Paul Dale both walked free, maintaining their innocence. Collins, already a seasoned criminal, eventually died of cancer in prison while serving a life sentence. Not for the Hodson murders, but for the killings of mother and son Dorothy and Ramon Abbey 7 years earlier. But conspiracy theories only deepened after Williams' death. Whispers of corruption surrounding his solicitor, hints of a cover-up, and a tangled web of underworld secrets that may never fully unravel. One thing is certain, Carl Williams' reign was soaked in blood, felt like the inevitable conclusion to a life built on betrayal and violence. But as with all gangland killings, the real tragedy lies with the families, those who lost loved ones to greed, power, and revenge. As for Matthew Johnson, he remains behind bars, where he belongs. If fate has its way, he'll never see the outside world again. That was it for today's video. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see our next videos.